Okay, I'm back. I ran out of batteries there. Sorry about that. But we were talking about democracy, and many of these theories about the workings of American democracy says that that each, they capture a part of us, but we got to understand them all in order to kind of get a good picture of all of American politics. So first off, let's look at people who think democracy is for everyone. So a lot of people think that the government ought to do what the majority of everyone wants. So this simple proposition is what we would call majoritarian theory. As a theory of what democracy should be like, majoritarianism is pretty popular among political scientists and ordinary people. They probably don't know that it's called majoritarianism. But actually, most people who study American government in depth find it's actually a pretty poor description of how it actually works. In particular, they point to the low level of turnout in elections. If we get more than 55% of people to even turn out for a presidential election, that's pretty lucky. So polling data kind of shows that many Americans are neither particularly interested in politics nor very well informed about it. So few are able to really name like who's running for Congress in their districts. Matter of fact, many can't even name who's the incumbent, who's the person in the office, and most of them can't even begin to tell you the candidate's position. So this idea that democracy is for everyone doesn't really work in reality. It's nice in theory. But how about democracy for the few? If ordinary citizens are not making decisions with their votes, then who is really making these decisions? Well, then one theory says that it's elites. This elitist theory then would say that its society is governed by a small number of people who exercise power to their self-interest. So they are controlling government to their best interest. Now, these people are pessimists to the core. They're, in a sense, they think American government is a sideshow, it's a sham. Elite theory, though, is usually used to describe the American system as a whole. Few people today think it's a very good idea, though, for the country to be run by some privileged minority that that's not in our best interest. But in the past, many people thought that it was appropriate for the country to be run by an elite group. Consider these words from Alexander Hamilton, one of the framers of the Constitution, and another pompous ass on your $10 bill. Quote, "All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The few, the first are the rich and the well-born. The other, the mass of people. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge to determine right. Give, therefore, to the first class a distinct permanent share in government. They will check the unsteadiness of the second, as they cannot receive any advantage by a change. They therefore will ever maintain good government." End quote. That's Alexander Hamilton from a speech in the Constitutional Convention regarding a plan for government. He actually was advocating to make a king and a royal bloodline for America. So he really was kind of out of touch with some things, although he did put us on a firm financial footing, so we got that going for us, which is pretty nice. Now, some people who believe in this, at least different versions of this elitist theory, propose that like a small, cohesive group of these elites make all the important decisions, that it's like a closed club. And then others think that voters choose among these competing elites. For example, one decade it's the Clintons, and another it's the Bushes, those kind of things. And that we get new members into that club through the elite educational system, and that only the brightest children of the masses have the opportunity to join this elite group. So the question I would ask to you would be, does the existence of a political dynasty such as the Kennedys or the Bushes or the Clintons, does that constitute an argument in favor of elite theory? It's something to think about. All right, so a third one would be democracy for groups. Is our democracy based upon group interests? If the average citizen can't keep up with political issues or cast a deciding vote in an election, will interest then be protected by the groups that they join? Some theorists subscribe to this theory called pluralism, which they see politics as a struggle among different interest groups to gain benefits for their members. For example, like the AARP, which is the American Association of Retired Persons. Now, given the structure of the American political system, groups, they conflict with each other, and they tend to settle these conflicts through compromise and accommodation. There are this host of different issues and interests and so forth among all these groups, and because they're constantly fighting with each other, none of them can dominate the political process. Now, furthermore, because most individuals have more than one interest and you belong to more than one group, conflicts among these groups doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be dividing the nation into hostile camps. You might win with one group and lose with another. Now, a lot of political scientists, and myself included, believe that pluralism actually works very well as a descriptive theory, but as a theory of how democracy itself should work, it has a lot of problems. Poor citizens are not represented very well by pluralism. You don't see people who are living in slums joining a lot of interest groups. They're just not very active. At the same time, wealthy and rich citizens are probably overrepresented in these groups. They join a lot of groups because they have a lot more time to be active in them. As political scientist E. Schattenheider once observed, quote, "The flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper-class accent," end quote. He's an interesting guy. There's no doubt, though, as to whether a group decision is making a decision in the best interest of the nation, I guess is the best way to put that. There is this danger that these groups could become so powerful that the decisions they make could compromise the interests of the individual and then only benefit them. And that way the public as a whole aren't really considered, nor is the individual really considered. It's just what's in my group's best interest. So some critics of pluralism have suggested that a democratic system can be virtually paralyzed by the struggle among these competing interest groups. Maybe sounds familiar as we think about how government is sometimes not very effective, especially in the American system. Let's look at some fundamental values, because we really need to talk about some cultural things. Right? So, what kind of values did the framers and writers of the Constitution, what kind of things did they believe in? We said they didn't believe strictly in democracy, more in a republic, but they kind of believed that the structures that they had created would definitively create a stable political system, which they're not going to have under the Articles of Confederation. They also believe that the nation would be sustained by its political culture, a set of ideas and values of the way people think about government and politics. You know, even today there's a lot of agreement, a lot of consensus out there among Americans about what it is to be free, and equality and property that are pretty basic among the U.S. political system. You know, if you've given the vast majority of Americans are actually descended from immigrants, and that we have very diverse backgrounds, I wonder what accounts for that. I wonder why we tend to all gravitate around liberty, equality, and property. I think it's probably the result of political socialization, the process that we as Americans bring new people into our system and transmit these values to new generations. The two most important sources for this political socialization is your family and our educational system. This dominant culture that we transmit to them is controlled by the political process and government within our society. Now, the dominant culture in the United States has its roots in Western European civilization. From that civilization, we have a bias toward individualism, we have a bias toward private property, and Judeo-Christian ethics. Our cultural heritage honors community and family over individualism, and sometimes places far less emphasis on materialism if the circumstances require it. Additionally, changes in our own society have led to the erosion of some values, such as the sanctity of the family.
Shakia, your people are about to leave you.
And acceptance of other values, such as women's pursuit of careers in the workplace. In the United States, civil liberties include religious freedom, right to practice whatever religion we choose, and freedom from state-imposed religion. Our civil liberties include freedom of speech, the right to express our opinions freely on all matters, including government actions. Freedom of speech is perhaps our most prized liberty because democracy would not endure without it. These basic guarantees of liberty are found in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. But liberty is not the only value held by Americans. A substantial portion of the American electorate believes that certain kinds of liberty threaten social order. The right to privacy, for example, is a particularly controversial liberty. The United States Supreme Court has held that the right to privacy can be derived from other rights that are explicitly stated in the Bill of Rights. Did you know that the word privacy is not found in the Constitution? But the Supreme Court has also held that under the right to privacy that the government cannot ban abortion or private homosexual behavior by consenting adults. Some Americans believe that such rights threaten the sanctity of the family and the general cultural commitment to moral behavior. Of course, others disagree. Security is another issue. When Americans have felt particularly fearful or vulnerable, the government emphasized national security over civil liberties. Following terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, Congress passed legislation that was designed to provide greater security at the expense of some civil liberties. But in particular, the USA Patriot Act gave law enforcement and intelligence gathering agencies much greater latitude to search out and investigate suspected terrorists. Many Americans objected to the Patriot Act later, pointing out that it compromised numerous civil liberties, such as protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. So when we're thinking about this balance between liberty and order, does national security concerns justify compromising liberty? For example, is it acceptable for the government to engage in surveillance programs without judicial oversight since 9/11? Things to think about. We also have to balance the idea of equality versus liberty. The Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal. And the proper meaning of equality, though, has been highly disputed throughout American history. Much of American history, not even American history, world history, per se, is the story about what it is to be equal, the value in equality. To promote equality, it's often necessary to place limits on the desire to treat some people unequally. So in this sense, liberty and equality are in conflict, aren't they? Today, let's say the denial of people of equal, or the denial of equal treatment of people of different races has very few defenders. But 60 years ago, that was the norm as people were separated by race, right here in this sort of room. How about the concept of economic equality? Equal treatment regardless of race, religion, gender. Those are all very popular today. But equal opportunity for individuals to develop their talents and skills is another value with considerable amount of support. Equality of economic status, though, is highly controversial. For much of history, few people even contemplated the idea that government could do something about the division between the rich and the poor. Most people assume that such an endeavor is either impossible or a waste of resources, undesirable. Now, this assumption did begin to lose some of its force in the mid to late 19th century. And this happened because the result of Western world becoming wealthier. And government began to take on larger projects, big scale projects. And as it did, some people began to advocate for this idea of universal equality. Some radicals dreamed of a revolutionary transformation of society that would establish an egalitarian system. That is, a system in which wealth and power would be redistributed on a more equal basis. But others, they rejected this vision, but still came to endorse the ideas of eliminating poverty and reducing economic inequality in society. So anti-poverty advocates believed then, and they still believe it now, that such a program could alleviate a lot of suffering. And in addition, they believe that reducing economic inequality promotes fairness. It enhances the moral tone in society. They don't think it's a bad thing. They just think it's difficult to achieve. Which takes us to property rights. The value of reducing economic inequality is in conflict also with the right to property. Now, this is because reducing economic inequality typically involves the transfer of property, usually in the form of money from one person to another. Now, for many people, liberty and property are closely entwined. They're one and the same. And our capitalist system is based upon the idea that one has the right to own property. Under capitalism, property consists not only of personal possessions, but also of wealth creating assets such as farms and factories. The investor-owned corporation is in many ways the preeminent capitalist institution. The funds invested by the owners of a corporation are known as capital, hence the very name of the system. Capitalism is also typically characterized by considerable freedom to make binding contracts and relatively unrestrained markets for goods, services, and investments. Property, especially wealth-creating property, can be seen as giving its owner political power and the liberty to do whatever he or she wants. But at the same time, ownership of property immediately creates inequality in society. The desire to own property, however, is so widespread among all classes of Americans that radical egalitarian movements have had a difficult time gaining a foothold in America. One of the things we hear about America is that the American dream is owning your own home. Let's think about big government. We hear a lot about big government. Opposition to big government. Been a pretty big constant theme in American politics. Indeed, the idea that the government is overreaching, they probably argued with that before the revolution. Big government, big Great Britain. But, tensions over the size of this, it's plagued Americans ever since that time period. There's probably not been a period of American history where they have not argued about the size of government. I read this especially in the local paper quite often. American citizens express contradictory opinions about the size of government and the role it should play in their lives. But the same people who complain about the amount of taxes paid in a year are also the same people who worry about the lack of money for teachers in their local schools. Individuals who fear about the next terrorist attack react in outrage when they hear about how the government is snooping through their email. Americans, they're likely to call for big government when they're reacting to a crisis. Let's think about 9/11, for example. After 9/11, the Bush administration substantially increased the scope of federal authority and government spending. Every time there's a crisis, the size and demands for government, or for an active government, increase. Let's think about Hurricane Katrina in 2005. When the levees that protected the city of New Orleans fell, floods covered the entire city. Thousands of poor people were stranded in horrific conditions, and many died. Americans blame government at just about every single level for that catastrophe. Many believe that repairing the devastation was a federal responsibility, and such activity inevitably requires tremendous government power and resources. Hence, government expands. How about the financial crisis in 2008? You had a whole bunch of mortgage holders that took out loans they could only pay back if the value of their home continued to rise. These people faced foreclosure. They're going to lose their home. And then you had a bunch of elaborate financial instruments based upon these mortgages that suddenly became nearly worthless. Institutions that held or guaranteed these securities faced bankruptcy. Do something. Government, do something. So in 2008, the government rescued investment bank Bear Stearns, insurance giant AIG, and the government-sponsored mortgage firms of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But they also let two other banks, Lehman Brothers and Washington Mutual, fail. Banks began to refuse to lend money to each other, fearing loans wouldn't be paid. cats and dogs began living with each other. The end was near. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson said to Congress, pass a $700 billion bailout bill for financial institutions, and government got bigger. How about in the area of civil liberties? Do we value limited government when it comes to our private lives and civil liberties? Probably more so than in most other democratic countries. We prize freedom of speech more than other countries. We don't really accept restrictions upon it. Let me give you an example. In Germany, display of the Nazi swastika is banned so completely that hobbyists may not affix historically accurate swastika decals to plastic models of World War II aircraft because it's against the law. Now that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. We would find such a law to be absurd, not only unconstitutional, but just dumb. But yet, in Germany, it has the support of a great deal of people. We worry about crime. But most people would be concerned about great miscarriages of justice if you learn that 99.8% of all criminal prosecutions resulted in a conviction. No, Israel, that's not true. But yet it is true in Japan. And how about this as a final example? The right to own firearms enjoys more protection here in the United States than anywhere else. Any measure to limit gun ownership results in a storm of controversy, even though thousands die through gun-related violence every year. Doesn't matter how many people we kill, don't take my gun. Okay, let's shift for a little bit. Let's talk about those political ideologies that we've talked about and that we need to make sure that we know. All right, now first, political ideology is a closely linked set of beliefs about politics. Political ideologies offer their adherents well-organized theories that propose goals for the society and means through which those goals can be achieved. Remember, it's a plan, right? They have a plan of action. At the core of every political ideology is the set of values, their guiding values. But the two most commonly referred to in discussions of American politics are conservatism and liberalism. So let's look at conservatism and liberalism. Let's get it on. All right. A set of beliefs called conservatism would include a limited role for the government in helping individuals. Conservatism typically has support for traditional values. These values typically include a strong sense of patriotism. Conservatives believe that the private sector probably can outperform the government in almost every single activity. Believing that the individual is primarily responsible for his or her own well-being, conservatives typically oppose government programs to redistribute income for change in the status of individuals. Conservatives have enjoyed considerable political success in hindsight, and even though they kind of got off track a little bit in 2006 and 2008, they had some dramatic successes in congressional elections in 2010, and this philosophy is going to be around for quite a while. It'll leave a dark, deep mark in American politics for a very long time. Now, the set of beliefs called liberalism includes the advocacy of government actions to improve the welfare of the individual, support for civil rights, and tolerance for political and social change. American liberals believe that a government should take positive actions to reduce poverty, to redistribute income from wealthy classes to poorer ones, and to regulate the economy. Liberals are often seen as an influential force in the Democratic Party, and conservatives are often regarded as the most influential force in the Republican Party. Now, a traditional method of comparing political ideologies is to arrange them on a continuum from left to right. based upon how much power the government should exercise to promote economic equality. That's that horizontal line on the spectrum. So we would call that a political spectrum. In addition to liberalism and conservatism, a traditional political spectrum typically would include the ideologies of socialism and libertarianism. Socialism falls on the left-hand side of the spectrum, and socialists play a minor role in the American political arena, although socialist parties and movements have been important in other countries around the world. Now, in the past, socialists have typically advocated replacing investor ownership of major businesses with either government ownership or ownership by employee cooperatives. Socialists, however, believe that such steps would break the power of the rich and lead to a more egalitarian or equal society. Now, in more recent times, socialists in Western Europe have advocated more limited programs that tend to redistribute income, and have had some not as much success as they've had in the past. Now, on the right side of the spectrum is libertarianism, a philosophy of skepticism toward most government activities. Now, libertarians strongly support property rights and typically oppose the economy and redistribution of income. Libertarians support laissez-faire capitalism. Now, laissez-faire is Francais for let it be. Libertarians also tend to oppose government attempts to regulate personal behavior and promote moral values. Now, we need to talk some more about liberals, because I only gave you a cursory description of liberalism, but the word liberal itself, we need to kind of get into it a little bit more, because it has a really odd history. If you describe yourself as a liberal, you're not giving us enough information, or at least depending on where you're from. The word liberty has the same root as the word liberal. Originally, they both meant free. Now, in a broad sense, the United States as a whole is a liberal country, and all of our ideologies are some variant of liberalism. But in a more restricted definition, a liberal, at least at the beginning of our country, was a person who believed in limited government and opposed religion and politics. 100 years ago, liberalism referred to a philosophy that in some ways resembled today's libertarian. For that reason, a lot of libertarians refer to themselves today as classical liberals. But what happened to the word liberal? How did it get hijacked and taken over? All right, so in the 19th century, the Democratic Party was seen more as the party against, it was seen as the anti-party, I guess you would say. It stood for more limited government. It was not the government of, it didn't stand for government change. It was in opposition to moralism in politics. They opposed Republican projects, for example, of they didn't want to use the government to build roads. They were against freeing slaves. Democratic Party typically stood in the way of repealing the sale of alcoholic beverages, so they were not in favor of repealing prohibition. But this began to change with Woodrow Wilson's presidency during World War I. And then by the time Franklin Roosevelt got into office in 1932, the Democratic Party is going to flip. They're going to flip-flop themselves into a party that stands for positive government actions to help the economy. Now, Roosevelt's going to call for all these new policies in his New Deal, but he's going to keep the language that Democrats have long used. He's going to call himself a liberal, but his policies are going to be the exact opposite. So this is, he's using the right language. Now, we'll discuss the history of the two political parties a lot later in the semester, But if you go outside the United States and Canada, the word liberal never changed. The meaning of it never changed. So for this reason, if you go, or if you hear a left-of-center European denounce President Reagan or Prime Minister Thatcher for their liberalism, what they really mean is that the two leaders were enthusiastic advocates of laissez-faire capitalism and almost libertarianism. So they were classical liberals from that perspective. So they're kind of backwards. Well, hope I didn't confuse you anymore than you probably already are. Don't worry, most of us are already confused about it too. Now, what's the problem with that linear line that we talked about, where it was just from one point to the other? Well, one of those problems is that the traditional left to right spectrum doesn't really reflect the complexities of the modern human political system. Let's take libertarians, for example. Libertarians are typically placed to the right of conservatives. And if the only question we were asking ourselves was, how much control should the government have over the economy, then that would be right. But libertarians also advocate the most complete freedom as possible in social matters. They oppose government actions to promote moral values, such as they don't want the government snooping on their private lives in their own home. So putting them there is not quite right. They seem to favor such actions that are more often favored by liberals. So it doesn't seem to be the right place to put them. Liberalism is often described as an ideology that supports big government. And if the objective is only to promote equality, then that description would have some validity. But in the moral sphere, conservatives tend to support more government regulation of social values and moral decisions than liberals do. Therefore, conservatives tend to oppose gay and lesbian rights legislation and typically propose strong curbs on pornography. Liberals show greater tolerance for alternative lifestyle choices and oppose government attempts to regulate personal behavior and morals. So it's really not about big government for them either in personal behavior. So that line doesn't really explain it all. So for a more sophisticated breakdown, we're going to use a four-corner grid. The grid provides four possible ideologies. Each quadrant contains a substantial portion of the American electorate. Individual voters may fall anywhere on the grid depending on the strength of their beliefs about economic and cultural issues. Now note, there's no generally accepted term for persons in, say, the left lower position, which are typically referred to as populists. This term can be fairly misleading because, not everyone who calls himself a populist has the same values. The term's too general. Individuals who are economic liberals and cultural conservatives tend to support government action both to promote the values of economic equality and fairness and to defend traditional values such as the family and marriage. So these individuals, they might describe themselves as conservative or moderate, but they might still be Democrats due to their support for economic fairness. Or they might vote for a Republican candidate due to their conservative values. So you can't really pigeonhole anyone in the American electorate into one certain particular area. If the traditional political spectrum held, most voters fall into the liberal or conservative quarter of our ideological grid. But actually, there's a substantial number of voters in each quadrant. Asking whether the government should guarantee each person a job, for example, divides the electorate in half if you think about it from an economic perspective. A question on abortion divides the electorate in half in the social dimension. Knowing how a voter answered one of these questions, however, doesn't tell us how they answered the other one, does it? many of them would give a liberal answer to the jobs question, but yet give a conservative answer to the abortion question. So we don't know anything more than what we did before. Now, even though all four of these ideologies are popular, it doesn't follow that the various labels that we've just discussed are equally favored. Voters are much more likely to describe themselves as conservative than they are as liberal. And there's a wide variety of reasons for this, but the most popular one is that the word liberal has become synonymous with the word radical. And the word conservative implies moderate. Most Americans value moderation, so therefore the conservative label has this advantage. Indeed, there's not even many politicians, even in the safest districts, that are willing to describe themselves as liberal. So therefore, they took another label. They call themselves progressive instead. And the designation libertarian has an even more radical flavor than liberal, and the number of voters with libertarian tendencies far exceeds the number of voters or people who adopt the label and call themselves libertarian, simply so they typically just call themselves Republican. So these labels, they just hard to pigeonhole people with. Okay, let's talk about some non-democratic ideologies to kind of give you some more details. We're almost done. Let's talk about three of these that don't really fit into the political spectrum. Some totalitarian ideologies. Communism, fascism, and Islamism. None of these have had a significant following in the United States, but we still need to know a little bit about them. Their impact on Europe and Asia, though, and on world history, has had a very large impact over the past 100 years. Talk about communism first. A variant of socialism is communism. Communism favors a partisan dictatorship, government control of all commercial enterprises, no private property, and the replacement of all free markets with central planning. The first communists were a radical faction that broke away from the socialist movement. Now, traditionally, socialists have always considered themselves to be Democrats and wanted to gain power through the electoral system. The communists, though, believed that they could abolish capitalism and establish socialism through a bloody revolution and a severe partisan dictatorship. The Soviet Union, founded by Russian communists after World War I in 1917, succeeded in establishing government control of farms, factories, and businesses of all kinds, and replacing the market system with central planning. Under Joseph Stalin, from 1924 to 1953, the Soviet Union also developed into a brutal, totalitarian regime, with Stalin murdering over 40 million of his own citizens. There are many other communist regimes in the world. Let's talk a little bit about fascism. Now, the most famous example of fascism is Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945, and as with communism, the success of fascism depended on a large body of disciplined followers and popular appeal. Fascism, however, championed elitism rather than egalitarianism. It's strongly influenced by Charles Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest. It values action over rational deliberation and explicitly rejects liberal individualism. It exalts the national collective, unites behind an absolute ruler. Fascism appealed to patriotism or nationalism, but it took these good concepts and shaped Kahneman's sentiments with them into virulent racism. It's the mentality of the mob. And after World War II, fascism is pretty much a defeated and rejected ideology. The final one here that we're going to talk about is Islamism. The terrorists who attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on September 11 were ideologically motivated individuals. These terrorists were members of the Al-Qaeda network led by Osama bin Laden. Al-Qaeda's ideology is based on a radical and fundamental interpretation of Islam, an interpretation known as Islamism. Now, many other terrorist organizations other than Al-Qaeda have an Islamist orientation. Radical Islamists reject all Western democratic values. Many of them call for the establishment of a worldwide Islamic theocracy, the Caliphate. And remember now, a theocracy is a government by religious leaders. The Taliban in Afghanistan were, in fact, were able to impose an Islamist-based government on the people of that country until they were brought down in late 2001 by a U.S.-led invasion and internal opponents supported by Western nations. Now, radical Islamism has become an increasingly widespread ideology, and the United States will probably be responding to various Islamist movements for many, many years to come. Okay, so final comments. Let's think about a couple of quotes and a little bit about trust. In 1787, after the Constitutional Convention had ended, a woman stopped Benjamin Franklin on his way out of Independence Hall in Philadelphia and asked him, quote, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" And Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." I think this quote reveals Franklin's deep-felt concern over whether this country, which had been through so much during the Revolution and the Articles of Confederation, would last. I think it also reflects the framers' belief that a free government is not just based on the consent of the governed, but depends on those same people taking an active part in said government. Thomas Jefferson once said, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." Therefore, when half of the population shows up for an election, when citizens don't speak out on budget issues, when they show apathy, when their elected leaders are reelected time and again, even after they've been tainted by scandal, by the few that do bother to show up, are we failing you, or are you failing us? While citizen trust in government peaked in the wake of 9/11, it then fell on a downward trajectory that dates all the way back to the 1960s. In 2007, the New York Times and CBS poll put trust in government at 24%, the lowest it has ever recorded in its 17-year history. In 2008, in a Times poll, 81% of people said that the country is on the wrong track. In other polls, a majority of respondents said that government does not listen to people like me. In the past 6 years, those polls have not improved. By the beginning of George W. Bush's second term as president, many Americans had come to feel that they were helpless in the face of a government that felt no need to be accountable to the public. The most recent congressional elections showed that the nation wanted to change course. Democrats gained a majority in Congress in 2006, yet they did not have enough votes to change the administration's direction. Negative actions toward the U.S. government also grew in many foreign countries. According to the Pew Global Attitudes Project from 2002 to 2007, favorable views of America fell in 26 of 32 countries in which they collected data. From 2008 to 2012, that trend continued with all but 2 having failing favorable views. Muslim countries were particularly anti-American, but unfavorable attitudes also increased in Western Europe and in Asia. Even as popular disaffection with the U.S. government grew, the Bush administration continued its powers of expansion of the executive. On Although Vice President Dick Cheney was the administration's most prominent advocate of the expanded powers, he clearly had the backing of the president himself. The essence of the new doctrine was that presidential power could not be limited by any law or treaty when the president acts to protect the national security. Furthermore, the president alone decides what constitutes a threat to the national security. Members of the administration strongly believed that these powers were essential to protect the nation from the threat of Islamist terrorism. The Obama administration has continued to support this doctrine throughout its time in office. During the first 6 years of the Bush presidency, Congress and the courts, for the most part, did not question these unprecedented claims of authority. Actions based on the new doctrine included refusing to implement the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, to which the United States is a signatory, approving interrogation techniques considered to constitute torture, surveilling U.S. citizens without obtaining a warrant from a court, and arresting U.S. citizens on U.S. soil as an alleged enemy combatant, and holding those persons indefinitely without review by any court. This action suspends a fundamental constitutional right known as habeas corpus, under which those arrested have the right to appear in court and challenge their arrest and detention. The last action was striking because it suggested that the government could indefinitely imprison and indeed mistreat anyone at the president's sole discretion. In 2007, Attorney General Alberto Gonzales claimed before a Senate committee that the U.S. Constitution does not guarantee habeas corpus rights to U.S. citizens. This is the top law enforcement officer of the United States. In addition to expanding presidential powers, the Bush administration also increased federal spending to a degree not seen in half a century. The Obama administration then doubled those numbers. Even setting aside the costs of the Iraq War and the War on Terror, government spending has increased at an unprecedented rate. Current federal debt stands at over $17 trillion. Republican columnist David Brooks approvingly described the results as big government conservatism, a reversal of previous conservative attitudes toward government spending. Now go back. Think about the Franklin and Jefferson quotes that I read to you. A republic, if you can keep it, and the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. This is what they meant. Citizens have to be ever vigilant, or otherwise government will usurp power that they have no right to use. Our goal this semester is to educate you on what is proper and allowable, how to challenge the decisions of those in positions of authority, and how to hang on to the great legacy that has been passed to you by the framers of the Constitution. You, the citizen, have the right to be free. And that right has been secured for you by the sacrifices of those that came before. But you must educate yourself in order to prevent others from taking that freedom and using it for evil purposes. One may not be eternally vigilant if one does not know what to look for. This is Mr. L. First week is done. Get this out to you. Have a great one. Be excellent.